David, thank you so much. And I'm very grateful for the invitation to come here and speak to the UNA Lewisham branch. And it's nice, particularly, I think, because the spirit that gave birth to the United Nations was the same spirit which gave birth to War on Want. We're slightly younger, born in 1951, but it came out of that whole spirit coming out of the darkness, I suppose, of the colonial period and hoping for a world where we, the peoples, could actually make common cause and build a better future together. And I'm here to talk about TTIP, and I've given everybody on their seats one of the copies of the book, one of which will also go to Damien, so that he has no excuse to leave feeling bereft of that information. And the reason why this has become a big issue for War on Want is because we feel this is actually one of the largest single transfers of power in a generation away from we, the peoples, towards transnational capital. And it's a power shift which is helping transnational corporations to see the Atlantic as their playground to be able to make profits almost without restriction. And that's why for us it's such an important issue. That's why increasingly across Europe, both in the wake of the elections and also in the run-up to the formation of a new commission later on this year, it's becoming a bigger and a bigger deal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend this 15-20 minutes just going through some of the background, where it came from, some of the content, what's in it and why we should be worried about it, and then bringing you up to date with some of the most recent developments and what's actually being seen politically around both in the UK and also in the rest of Europe. Where did it come from? It was launched last year, so it's a new thing, launched by Barack Obama in his State of the Union address back in February, and the first round of negotiations between the European Commission and the US government took place in July. We've now had the fifth round. These negotiations take place entirely in secret, behind closed doors. The documents which are negotiated upon are completely locked. We've been told that there's a 30-year public exclusion on getting to see them. So, you know, it's going to be completely and utterly finished without our seeing at all. But actually the impetus for TTIP came much earlier. In the mid-90s, Transatlantic business dialogue was set up, where business on both sides of the Atlantic tried to push for a free trade agreement, to almost sort of bring a customs union like we saw in the European Union, but include the US. And it failed then, but they continued to harbour this dream of a corporate playground across the Atlantic which they could build, and it's only now that they're trying once again to put that into reality. But it's also useful to look at how this relates to the history of trade policy more generally. People have probably heard more about the World Trade Organization, the WTO, which was a big thing, say, a dozen years ago. We had the big demonstrations on the streets of Seattle back in 1999, and then the launch of the Doha round of World Trade talks. But these talks pretty much hit the buffers from 2004 onwards. And gradually, you saw the European Union, particularly under Peter Mandelson when he was the Trade Commissioner, and the US, turning more and more to bilateral treaties. So the multilateral forum of the WTO was abandoned. It's still sort of just about scraping along the bottom. But now they're putting much more faith in bilateral treaties. And the bilateral nature of the EU-US treaty, TTIP, is particularly important in this regard, because the US and the EU between them are the two largest trading blocs in the world. And what they can cement as a trade deal between them on trade and investment, that will set the standard for the rest of the world. And they're saying this absolutely explicitly. This isn't just about EU-US relations. This is going to be the gold standard, a template for everybody else in the world to follow. And the Chinese, and the Brazilians, and the Indians, and the Argentinians, everybody is being made to wake up and see this, not just as an EU-US thing, but as the start of something big for everybody around the world. There are three main areas to TTIP, three main pillars of the agreement, if you want. The first is that it is very much a deregulatory agenda. It's about removing the regulations which prevent business on both sides of the Atlantic from being able to operate as they would like. And that makes it different from traditional trade agreements. Traditional trade agreements are usually based on tariff barriers. So the import taxes that you have to pay if you're trading coffee to one country or bananas to another country or cars or steel, traditionally, all the way up until particularly the 1990s, trade negotiations have been about lowering those tariff barriers. What TTIP does is it continues a new wave of looking behind the border and looking at what they call non-tariff barriers. But the non-tariff barriers, these regulatory barriers, are actually the things that we consider to be most important in our lives. Because if, let's say, a corporation finds that it can't make as much money because of labour standards and it wants to lower labour standards, then that becomes a barrier for them. Or, to take an absolutely real example in this, if US corporations find that they can't trade genetically modified food into Europe, then that becomes a barrier to them. The block, the ban, becomes a barrier. And that's a real thing, because 70% of all food sold in US supermarkets contains GM ingredients. And in Europe, it's none. Similarly on pesticides, the rules that US corporations have to follow on pesticides are far, far, far less stringent than they are in the EU. So 40% of all of the grain that they would export from the US can't be exported into Europe because of the bans that we have on pesticides residue. Beef, I'm actually a vegetarian, so I have less intrinsic interest in this, but beef, 90% of all beef which is produced in the US is produced with a growth hormone. The growth hormone is injected into cattle so that they will grow quicker, and therefore you won't have to pay so much to feed them, and therefore they become more profitable. But the growth hormone has been found to be carcinogenic. In the States, the regulations are so weak that they eat this all the time. In Europe, the scientists have said it's an absolute no, and we've had a ban on that for 20 years. Under TTIP, the US companies are saying that's a barrier to trade. Why are we not allowed to trade our beef into Europe? And it's exactly that sort of thing that we're being asked to get rid of. And the difference between Europe and the US in terms of regulations is huge. In Europe, we abide by what's called the precautionary principle. If you can't prove it's safe, you're not allowed to put it into commercial use. In the US, it's exactly the opposite way around. If the government can't prove it's unsafe, then go for it. And it's exactly that difference which is being brought into play by TTIP as they engage in the new race to the bottom. So that's the first thing, the deregulatory agenda. The second thing, and this I'm sure is going to be particularly pertinent to those of you who fought in Lewisham around the privatisation of health and to save the hospital. TTIP is about creating new markets for capital. It's expanding the reach of transnational corporations into public services, but also into government procurement contracts, so the local government contracts which you could want to use for all sorts of social and environmental benefits. TTIP says we've got to pull that back into open market competition. And this isn't actually just about the US coming into Britain and saying we want to do that, or into other countries of Europe. It's also something where the European Commission, on behalf of its companies, has said we really want to open up the US. Why? Because in the USA, a lot of states have Buy America clauses, which are used at the local level to protect jobs, to protect small and medium-sized businesses against competition, to allow them to grow, to allow them to provide decent work for the local populace. This is bad news if you're a European company trying to take over those markets. So the European Commission says, we want to get rid of those things. But also, we know this from our private meetings with the British government officials here, the British government quite likes the idea of TTIP completing, as they say, completing the single market in Europe. And it's about then opening up more contracts, opening up more opportunities for private capital in the markets of Italy, France and Spain, where they still try to use the opportunity of local public procurement to enable local businesses to grow. Privatisation of public services is also a big threat, and not just through TTIP, but also through the local acts. We know here, with the Health and Social Care Act, that the government has already opened up the NHS to any number of private contractors. Well, under TTIP, you won't be able to get it back. Once you have put your health services within a trade agreement, it's irreversible. You don't get it back again. And that's why the Labour Party under Andy Burnham, which actually is fairly okay with all of this stuff, unbelievably, they don't like the fact that the NHS will be irreparably lost if it goes through. So deregulation is the first pillar, privatisation is the second pillar, and the third pillar is about special new rights for investors. So foreign investors get this clause around investor protection, so that if they invest either from the US into Europe or the Europe into the US, they will get these new protections, and particularly a new power so that they can bypass domestic courts and go to international arbitration tribunals to challenge national public policy choices. A new power to bypass all of the legal frameworks that we have to abide by and which local businesses have to abide by, and to go to a higher court if they want to try and challenge local laws. And again, I'll give you examples, because it's only really through examples that we know what this means in practice. In Germany, in the wake of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, you may remember the German government, facing huge pressure from the streets, said from 2022 we will no longer sustain nuclear power plants in Germany. So from 2022 they're phasing out nuclear power in Germany and putting their trust in renewables instead. Vattenfall, a Swedish company which ran 2 of the old nuclear power plants, is suing the German people for 3.7 billion euros. 3.7 billion euros, because that's what it's saying it will therefore lose in profits as a result of not being able to operate nuclear power plants into the future. Australia, back in 2012, introduced, as you may know, brown paper packaging on all tobacco. So if you've got cigarettes being marketed in Australia, they can no longer have the Marlboro or the Rothmans, or probably Rothmans don't exist anymore, but anyway, all of the packaging that you would have. Australia said for public health reasons, we want to de-glamorise smoking and we want to have everything put in brown paper packaging. They're being sued by Philip Morris, the big tobacco producers, for loss of earnings and also for the loss of intellectual property. They're being sued, again, for billions of dollars. Uruguay, which has put in the same public health requirements on tobacco marketing, is also being sued by Philip Morris. There are over 500 cases that we know about, although again, these take place in secret, these cases. There are over 500 cases around the world where corporations have been given this new power to go to these international arbitration tribunals and sue governments. And these aren't even real courts. These are like kangaroo courts. Basically, you have 3 judges, but they're not judges, they're corporate lawyers, who meet without public tenure. They meet without any sense of oversight or accountability, and often they've got it so dramatically wrong that other people in the legal profession are saying this is making a complete mockery of what we thought was commercial law. And yet it's being sustained, and yet we're being told for the first time we're going to introduce this new power for US corporations to come in and to be able to bypass domestic courts and use these new tribunals. And that is becoming a real scandal across Europe. So that's the third element of it, and it takes me in to sort of the update of where we are. Because so great has been the outrage at these new powers being handed over to corporations that even the German government and the French government are beginning to buckle. And they started saying within the European Commission, this is so unpopular, this is beginning to derail the entire operation. And so the European Commission has had to stop negotiating on this particular power, the investor-state dispute settlement, and put it out to public consultation. And the public consultation is ongoing right now, and it will close at the 6th of July. But also, more than that, the case that was made for TTIP is completely crumbling. From the beginning, they got some studies which suggested that it's going to be billions and billions of pounds of extra money sloshing around as a result of this. They do this every time that there's a trade agreement. They start saying it's going to bring millions of pounds, millions of jobs. And everybody says, we like that. Millions of pounds, millions of jobs, it sounds good. But always, the experience has been completely the opposite. Take NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was introduced in 1994. Trade unions were promised hundreds of thousands of new jobs as a result of it. In reality, all of the studies show in the US they lost over 1 million jobs net as a result of NAFTA. Mexico, which was promised huge amounts of new jobs, 2 million campesina farmers in the fields lost their jobs because all of the contracts went to the Midwest farmers. With, 5 people who sit behind these vast, great big combine harvesters can do the same job as hundreds of thousands. And so it's been a lose-lose situation for Labour. Similarly, in respect of the claims made for TTIP, you might have heard a lot of MPs in this country standing up, Labour, Conservative and Lib Dem, standing up and saying, £10 billion, we're going to get £10 billion out of this. Well, we meet with the government officials, and the government officials absolutely openly say, we've no idea whether those figures will stand up. We met with Ken Clarke, the minister who's responsible for selling TTIP to the country, and he said, we don't believe him for a minute. And yet, a week after having told us that we shouldn't believe the government figures, he put them out in a letter to all MEPs saying, £10 billion, that sounds good, doesn't it? And it's that level of barefaced cheek, to give it a sort of a nice word, that we're facing in the fight against TTIP. But the last thing I was going to say is this. There are bigger reasons which are also being brought to the fore in terms of the geopolitical basis for this deal. The first is the one which we knew already. Europe and the US are spooked by the rise of China, Brazil, India, and this is a new opportunity for them to make common cause to develop a new bloc, a transatlantic bloc, which can fight off the challenge from these emerging market economies. That we already knew. But the second element, which is being brought into play much more strongly now, is that under these free trade rules, the US is much more able to export natural resource, and particularly natural energy resources. And shale gas, which is now being pumped out of the US at any rate, and the tar sands, which is being taken out of Canada and put through in the big pipelines into the US, will be able to be exported to Europe much more easily as a result of having a free trade agreement with the US. And of course, what everyone's now saying is, that means you're less dependent on Russia. And suddenly it's all being brought together with that idea of, let's break from this terrible dependency we have on Russia and nasty Mr. Putin, and therefore let's cement that US-EU relationship, which will then give us much more cheap gas, cheap oil. We won't have to bother with those pesky renewables, and we'll be able to continue with fossil fuels for the rest of time. And that's the new strategic element which is being brought in right at this moment. The final thing I want to say is in relation to the actions that are coming across Europe and in Britain. In Germany, this has already been a massive issue. It's been in newspaper reports, television reports. There's been a massive uproar about it, and they just had a poll which was published last week. 55% of the German people say, no, we want nothing to do with TTIP. The DGB, which is the German equivalent of the TUC, so the German Trade Union Confederation, it has said quite clearly, we want to stop this agreement. We want to halt the negotiations. And that's important, because the German trade unions are usually the ones which are most pro-free trade. They're obviously the ones in the strongest manufacturing sector in Europe. We in Britain are now beginning to build a similar movement, a similar movement of saying no to TTIP. Trade unions like Unison, GMB, UCU in higher education, NUT for the teachers, have all come out and said no to TTIP. We and many other NGOs and Friends of the Earth from the environmental side are also part of this movement. And we've got a national tour of action and a day of action coming up in July, to which everybody here is really, really welcome to come along. The London part of that tour is going to be on the 10th of July in the evening. It's up at the NUT's hall in central London, in Mander Hall, so 7 o'clock on the 10th of July. And then there's going to be a day of action on the 12th of July with protests outside Europe House. Everybody is really warmly urged to get involved in this campaign. As I said at the beginning, this is a battle that we cannot afford to lose. But I am optimistic, and the reason for that is this. When they tried to introduce these same powers for multinational corporations back in the 1990s, we defeated it. In 1998, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, which tried to incorporate exactly these same powers, was defeated. They tried then to bring them in through the WTO. They had an agenda of trying to expand the WTO's remit, and that failed. 2004, all of these issues were thrown off the table. They tried to bring them in the Western Hemisphere through the free trade area of the Americas, which was George W. Bush's greatest dream. It went nowhere, and it was kicked out. People power can be really effective against this, and we're already beginning to see their case crumbling. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of this information, to share some of the hopes that we have around fighting back against TTIP with everybody here. I'm really grateful, as I say, to the UNA Lewisham branch for the opportunity to come along and speak tonight. I'm very happy to engage in the discussion, and thank you so much.